The dust settled like ash on her trembling hands as Clara pressed herself against the weathered planks of the abandoned station. Every shadow held his face, every sound carried his voice, promising death. She clutched the leather satchel against her chest, feeling its weight like a stone in her soul. The afternoon sun burned merciless overhead, but she shivered as if winter had claimed her bones. When the stranger's boots echoed across the platform, she knew her running had led her to either salvation or a different kind of grave. "He'll kill me if I go back," she whispered to the wind, not knowing that some secrets kill you even when you run. The abandoned train station stood like a monument to forgotten dreams, its paint peeling in long strips that curled and twisted in the desert wind. Clara had been hiding behind the water tower for 3 hours, watching the horizon for any sign of dust clouds that might herald his approach. Her dress, once the color of summer wheat, now bore the stains of 2 days' desperate flight across the unforgiving Texas landscape. The leather satchel never left her grip, its brass clasps warm from her constant touch, its contents a burden heavier than any physical weight she had ever carried. She pressed her back against the sun-baked wood and tried to still her racing heart, knowing that panic would be her enemy now more than ever. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead, as if even the birds sensed the danger that followed in her wake. Every muscle in her body ached from sleeping on hard ground and walking through thorny brush, but the pain in her flesh was nothing compared to the terror that had taken root in her chest. She could still feel his hands around her throat, still hear his voice promising that death would be a mercy compared to what he would do if she ever tried to leave again. The bruises on her arms had faded from purple to yellow, but the marks on her soul remained fresh and bleeding. Clara closed her eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like, but all she could summon was the image of his face when he discovered her gone, the rage that would have consumed him like wildfire. She had taken something that belonged to him, something he would kill for, something that made her both victim and thief in the eyes of any law that might find her. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing, making each breath a conscious effort. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her blood turn to ice water in her veins, and she pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the water tower. Through a gap in the weathered boards, she watched a lone rider emerge from the heat shimmer, his silhouette dark against the burning sky. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who belonged to this harsh land, his hat pulled low against the sun, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Clara's fingers tightened on the satchel as she studied his approach, searching for any sign that he might be one of her husband's men, any hint that her flight had been discovered. The rider's horse was a sturdy bay gelding, well cared for but not fancy, the mount of a working man rather than a hired gun. As he drew closer, she could see the lines of his face, weathered by sun and wind, but not cruel. His eyes scanning the station with the wariness of someone who had learned to read danger in the landscape. Something in his bearing spoke of strength without brutality, of a man who might understand the difference between justice and vengeance. When he dismounted and began walking toward the station, Clara felt her last reserves of courage begin to crumble like sand. She had nowhere left to run, no strength left for another desperate flight across the desert, no hope left that she could outrun the consequences of what she had done. The satchel seemed to burn against her chest, its contents a testament to her desperation and her guilt, a burden she could neither carry nor abandon. She thought of the life she had left behind, the woman she had been before fear became her constant companion, before love had twisted into something dark and possessive. The stranger's footsteps echoed on the wooden platform above her hiding place, each sound like a nail being driven into the coffin of her old life. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore, asking not for salvation, but simply for the courage to face whatever came next. When she opened them again, the stranger was standing at the edge of the platform, looking down at her with eyes the color of storm clouds. and she knew that her running was finally over. His voice, when he spoke, was like gravel smoothed by water, rough but not unkind. "Ma'am, you look like you could use some help." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger, and Clara felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg. She had been running for so long that she had forgotten what kindness sounded like, had forgotten that there were still men in the world who might offer aid without expecting payment in flesh or fear. But even as hope flickered to life in her heart, the weight of the satchel reminded her that she was not the innocent victim she appeared to be, that the help she needed might cost more than this stranger was willing to pay. She looked up into his face and saw something there that made her want to trust, want to believe that sanctuary was possible, even as her mind screamed warnings about the danger of hope. The sun beat down mercilessly on both of them, creating a moment suspended between past and future, between the woman she had been and the woman she might yet become. When she finally found her voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper, carrying all the weight of her desperation and her shame. "He'll kill me if I go back," she said, and the words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, visible and choking and impossible to take back. Henry Caldwell had seen enough broken things in his 35 years to recognize the particular way a person shattered when hope died slowly. The woman crouched in the shadow of the water tower looked like a bird with a broken wing, beautiful and fragile and utterly lost. Her dress had once been fine, he could tell, but now it hung on her frame like a shroud, torn and stained by hard travel and harder choices. The way she clutched that leather satchel told him everything he needed to know about desperation, about the kind of fear that made people carry their whole world in their hands. He had come to the abandoned station looking for strays from his herd, but instead he had found something far more dangerous than lost cattle. The smart thing would be to mount his horse and ride away, to pretend he had never seen the terror in her green eyes or heard the way her voice broke when she spoke of death. But Henry Caldwell had never been accused of being smart when it came to helping folks who needed it, and the woman before him needed help more than anyone he had ever encountered. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle as he would with a spooked horse, knowing that sudden movements or harsh words might send her running back into the desert to die. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that held the kind of knowledge that aged a person beyond their years. When she spoke her name, it came out like a confession, like she was admitting to a crime she wasn't sure she had committed. Clara. It suited her, he thought, clean and simple and honest, nothing like the complicated mess of fear and secrets that surrounded her like a storm cloud. He could see the way she measured him, looking for signs of violence or cruelty, searching his face for any hint that he might be another predator in a world that seemed full of them. The fact that she was still alive, still fighting, told him something about the strength hidden beneath her fragile exterior. This was not a woman who gave up easily, not someone who would run, unless the alternative was death, or something worse than death. "I'm Henry," he said, settling himself on the edge of the platform so he wouldn't tower over her, making himself smaller and less threatening. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, but it's got walls and a roof and food." The offer hung between them, like a bridge across a chasm, and he could see her weighing it against whatever horrors she was running from. The satchel never left her grip, and he found himself wondering what could be so important that she would risk everything to keep it close. Money, maybe, or papers that proved something someone didn't want proved. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that would explain the haunted look in her eyes and the way she flinched when the wind rattled the loose boards of the station. He had learned long ago not to ask too many questions when someone was running, had learned that sometimes the answers were more dangerous than the ignorance. But looking at Clara, seeing the way she held herself like she was carrying the weight of the world, he found himself wanting to know everything about the storm that had driven her to his doorstep. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Henry knew that nightfall in the desert was no place for a woman alone. "You can't stay here," he said, and saw the way her body tensed, ready to run again despite her exhaustion. "It gets cold at night, and there's things out there that hunt in the dark." He wasn't talking about animals, and they both knew it. Men like the one she was running from didn't give up easily, didn't let their property walk away without a fight. The thought of what might happen to her if they found her here, alone and defenseless, made something cold and hard settle in his chest. He had seen what men could do to women when they thought no one was watching, had seen the aftermath of that kind of violence too many times to count. The scars on his own hands told the story of the last time he had tried to intervene, the last time he had let his conscience override his common sense. But looking at Clara, seeing the way hope and fear warred in her expression, he knew he would make the same choice again, consequences be damned. "Why would you help me?" she asked, and the question carried the weight of someone who had learned not to trust kindness. Someone who had been taught that every gift came with a price. Henry considered his answer carefully, knowing that the wrong words might send her running back into the desert, might convince her that his offer was just another trap in a world full of them. The truth was complicated, tangled up with his own ghosts and regrets, with the memory of another woman who had needed help and hadn't received it in time. But Clara didn't need to hear about his failures, didn't need to carry the burden of his guilt along with her own. What she needed was simple honesty, the kind of straightforward truth that cut through fear and doubt like a knife through cloth. He looked into her eyes and saw himself reflected there, saw the same loneliness and hunger for connection that had driven him to this abandoned place in search of something he couldn't name. The desert had a way of stripping people down to their essential selves, of revealing the truth that lay beneath all the pretense and protection. In that moment, under the vast Texas sky, they were just two broken people finding each other in the wilderness. "Because everyone deserves a chance to start over," he said finally, and the words carried the weight of conviction, the kind of truth that couldn't be argued with or explained away. Clara stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for deception or hidden motives, and Henry let her look, let her see whatever she needed to see to make her choice. The satchel shifted in her grip, and for a moment he thought she might open it, might show him whatever secret she was carrying. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, something had changed. Some wall had crumbled just enough to let hope slip through. "All right," she whispered, and the words were like a prayer answered, like the first rain after a long drought. Henry stood and extended his hand to help her up, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it, her fingers small and cold in his calloused palm. As she rose to her feet, the satchel swung against her hip, and Henry caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold, something that changed everything he thought he knew about the woman he had just offered to protect. Henry's hands trembled as he stared at the contents of Clara's satchel, the lamplight casting dancing shadows across objects that should not exist in any decent woman's possession. 3 small glass vials filled with a clear liquid, each one carefully wrapped in black velvet, nestled beside a leather-bound journal whose pages were filled with meticulous handwriting in a script he recognized from wanted posters. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest movement, while outside the wind howled through the broken timbers of the abandoned station. Clara's breathing had become shallow, her eyes fixed on his face as she watched understanding dawn in his expression, watched the color drain from his weathered cheeks as surely as water from a broken dam. The satchel seemed to grow heavier in his hands, as if the weight of her secrets had suddenly become tangible, pressing down upon his shoulders like the burden of knowledge he never wanted to carry. He'd seen those vials before, in the possession of a woman who had poisoned 3 men in Dodge City, a woman whose description matched Clara's perfectly except for the color of her hair, The journal fell open in his trembling fingers, revealing page after page of names, dates, and detailed accounts of deaths that had been attributed to natural causes across 3 states. Each entry was written in the same careful hand, each death documented with the precision of a bookkeeper recording transactions, as if human lives were nothing more than numbers in a ledger. Henry's throat constricted as he read the names of men he had known, ranchers and businessmen who had died suddenly and mysteriously, their widows left wealthy and their deaths never questioned by authorities who saw only grieving women in need of comfort. The lamplight flickered across Clara's face, revealing not the frightened victim he had believed her to be, but something far more dangerous, something that made his skin crawl with the realization of how close he had come to becoming another entry in her deadly chronicle. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, only the soft sound of her breathing mixing with the whistle of wind through the broken walls. The distance between them seemed to expand and contract simultaneously, as if the very air had become thick with unspoken truths and the weight of decisions that could not be undone. "You're not running from your husband," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm that raged outside, each word falling between them like stones into a deep well. Clara's eyes never left his face, watching as understanding transformed his features from compassion to horror, from protector to potential victim, and she knew that this moment would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. The satchel hung between them like a confession, its contents spelling out a truth more damning than any testimony, more final than any judge's verdict. Henry's mind raced through the implications, through the realization that he was alone in an abandoned station with a woman who had killed more men than some outlaws, a woman who had perfected the art of appearing helpless while wielding death like a surgeon's scalpel. The journal trembled in his hands as he turned another page, revealing his own name written in her careful script, followed by a question mark and the notation, "Too isolated, too suspicious." Udit, his blood turned to ice as he realized how close he had come to becoming her next victim, how perfectly he had played into her hands by offering shelter to a woman who needed no protection because she was the danger itself. The wind outside seemed to echo the chaos in Henry's mind, howling through the broken station like the voices of Clara's victims crying out for justice. She remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap like a lady at tea, but her eyes held the calculating coldness of a predator who had been discovered but not yet cornered. The lamplight cast her shadow long and dark across the floor, stretching toward Henry like reaching fingers, and he found himself stepping backward without conscious thought. His body responding to a danger his mind was still struggling to comprehend. The journal contained more than just names and dates. It held detailed observations about each man's habits, his weaknesses, his desires, all carefully catalogued and exploited with the precision of a master craftsman. Henry realized that Clara had not stumbled into his life by accident, that their meeting at the station had been as carefully orchestrated as everything else in her deadly career. The satchel seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its contents representing years of careful planning and methodical execution, a testament to a mind that had turned murder into an art form. "How many?" Henry asked, though he was not certain he wanted to know the answer, his voice cracking like a boy's as the full magnitude of Clara's crimes settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The number of names in the journal seemed to multiply before his eyes, each one representing a life cut short, a family destroyed, a community left to mourn what they believed were natural tragedies. Clara's silence stretched between them, more damning than any confession, more terrifying than any scream, and Henry found himself backing toward the door, even as his rational mind told him that running would only delay the inevitable. The storm outside had intensified, as if nature itself was responding to the evil that had been unleashed within the station's walls, and the sound of rain against the broken roof created a rhythm like the beating of a dying heart. Henry's hand, found the doorframe behind him, the rough wood solid and real beneath his fingers, an anchor in a world that had suddenly become as unstable as quicksand. The weight of the journal in his other hand seemed to increase with each passing second, as if the accumulated guilt of Clara's victims was somehow transferring itself to him through the pages that documented their deaths. Clara finally spoke, her voice soft and melodious. The same voice that had pleaded for his protection just moments before, now revealed as the instrument of seduction that had lured so many men to their deaths. 17, she said simply, the word hanging in the air between them like a death sentence, and Henry felt his knees threaten to buckle under the weight of that single, devastating number. The lamplight seemed to dim, as if even the flame recoiled from the magnitude of her confession, and the shadows in the corners of the station appeared to deepen and writhe like living things. Henry's mind struggled to process the reality that he was standing mere feet away from a woman who had killed more people than some of the most notorious outlaws in the territory. A woman who had done it all while maintaining the facade of helpless femininity that society expected and protected. The journal slipped from his nerveless fingers, falling to the floor with a sound like thunder, its pages scattering in the wind that swept through the broken station, carrying with it the names and stories of the dead. Clara watched the pages flutter around them like fallen leaves, her expression never changing, as if the destruction of her careful records was of no more consequence than spilled milk. The scattered pages of Clara's journal danced around their feet like autumn leaves caught in a devil's wind, each sheet bearing witness to a life extinguished by the woman who now sat before Henry with the calm composure of a Sunday school teacher. Her hands remained folded in her lap, pale and delicate, hands that had measured poison with the precision of a pharmacist and administered death with the gentleness of a nurse. And Henry found himself staring at those deceptively innocent fingers as if they might transform into claws before his eyes. The storm outside had reached a crescendo, rain hammering against the station's broken roof with the fury of divine judgment, while inside the lamplight flickered and wavered, casting shifting shadows that seemed to give life to the ghosts of Clara's victims. Henry's back pressed against the doorframe, the rough wood digging into his spine, but he welcomed the discomfort as proof that he was still alive, still breathing, still capable of escape if he could summon the courage to turn and run. The distance between them seemed both infinite and negligible, as if Clara existed in a space outside normal reality, a creature who had stepped from the pages of a nightmare into his simple, predictable world. The number 17 echoed in his mind like a funeral bell, each repetition adding weight to the horror of what he had discovered, what he now knew about the woman he had offered to protect. Clara's voice, when she spoke again, carried the same gentle cadence that had first drawn his sympathy, but now Henry heard the underlying steel, the cold calculation that had allowed her to look into the eyes of dying men and feel nothing but satisfaction at a job well done. "You're wondering how?" she said, her head tilted slightly to one side like a curious child, and Henry realized that she was studying his reaction with the same clinical detachment she had probably shown while watching her victim succumb to her poison. The lamplight caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes, transforming them into something predatory, something that belonged in the face of a wolf rather than a woman. And Henry felt his mouth go dry as he understood that he was no longer looking at a human being, but at something that had learned to mimic humanity while remaining fundamentally alien to it. The journal pages continued to flutter around them, some catching on the broken furniture, others disappearing into the shadows. But Clara seemed unconcerned by the destruction of what must have been years of meticulous record-keeping. Her indifference to the loss of her documentation was perhaps more terrifying than the records themselves, suggesting that the deaths had become so routine, so unremarkable, that she no longer needed to keep track of them. "It started with my first husband," Clara continued, her voice taking on the dreamy quality of someone recounting a pleasant memory, and Henry felt bile rise in his throat as he realized she was about to share the origin story of her transformation from woman to monster. The wind outside seemed to pause, as if even nature was holding its breath to hear her confession, and the lamplight steadied, casting her face in sharp relief against the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Henry wanted to cover his ears, to run screaming into the storm, rather than listen to whatever revelation was about to spill from her lips. But he found himself frozen in place, trapped by a horrible fascination with the depths of human evil. Clara's eyes grew distant, looking not at Henry, but at something far beyond the walls of the station, something that existed only in her memory, and when she smiled, Henry felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. The expression was not one of madness or cruelty, but of simple pleasure, the look of a woman remembering a particularly satisfying meal or a beautiful sunset. And that normalcy was more terrifying than any display of obvious insanity could have been. "He was cruel," she said, and for a moment Henry heard an echo of the frightened woman who had begged for his protection. But the illusion shattered when she continued, "But not clever, and certainly not careful about what he ate or drank." The casual tone with which she described her first murder made Henry's skin crawl, as if she were discussing the weather or the price of cattle, and he realized that somewhere along the path of her life, Clara had crossed a line that separated the human from the inhuman, the civilized from the savage. The storm outside seemed to respond to her words, thunder rolling across the sky like the laughter of demons, and Henry found himself wondering if he was experiencing some kind of fever dream, some nightmare brought on by too much whiskey and too little sleep. But the cold air seeping through the broken walls was real. The weight of the satchel still heavy in his hand was real. And the woman sitting before him, calmly describing murder as if it were a household chore, was terrifyingly, undeniably real. The scattered pages of her journal rustled in the wind, and Henry caught glimpses of names and dates, fragments of lives that had been snuffed out by the woman who now watched him with the patience of a cat studying a mouse. Clara's confession continued to unfold, like a flower blooming in reverse, each revelation more horrifying than the last, each detail adding another layer to the portrait of a predator who had perfected her craft through years of practice. She spoke of learning to read men's desires, to become whatever they needed her to be, to slip into their lives like a key into a lock, opening doors that should have remained forever closed. Henry listened in growing horror as she described the careful selection of her victims, the months of preparation that went into each kill, the satisfaction she derived not just from the act itself, but from the knowledge that she would never be suspected, never be caught, never be held accountable for the lives she had taken. The lamplight seemed to pulse with each word she spoke, as if the flame itself was responding to the darkness of her revelations, and Henry found himself wondering how many other men had stood where he now stood, listening to Clara's voice in the moments before their own deaths. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside, and he realized that he might be hearing not just a confession, but his own death sentence, delivered in the gentle tones of a woman who had made murder her life's work. The wind outside began to die down, as if the storm had exhausted itself listening to Clara's tale. But the silence that followed was more ominous than any thunder, more threatening than any lightning. Clara's eyes refocused on Henry's face, and he saw in them a terrible clarity, a complete absence of doubt or remorse that told him she had already decided his fate. The scattered pages of her journal lay still now, their secrets exposed to the lamplight like bones bleached white by the desert sun. And Henry understood that he was looking at the physical evidence of a career that had spanned years and claimed lives across multiple states. The satchel in his hand seemed to burn with malevolent energy, its contents representing not just the tools of Clara's trade, but the accumulated weight of 17 souls crying out for justice. Henry's throat constricted as he realized that he was probably the only person alive who knew the truth about Clara's crimes, the only witness to her confession, and that knowledge made him either the most important man in the territory or the most doomed. The lamplight flickered one final time before steadying, casting Clara's face in sharp relief against the darkness, and Henry saw in her expression the calm certainty of a predator who had never failed to claim her prey. The silence that followed Clara's confession stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap under the weight of unspoken truths and the terrible knowledge that now hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Henry's hand tightened on the satchel, his knuckles white against the worn leather, while his mind raced through possibilities that all seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion. He would not leave this station alive unless he acted, and acted soon. Clara remained motionless, her hands still folded in her lap with the serene composure of a woman at prayer. But Henry could see the calculation behind her eyes, the careful assessment of angles and distances, the predatory patience of a hunter who had cornered her prey and was savoring the moment before the kill. The storm outside had reduced to a gentle patter of rain against the broken roof, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how this deadly game would play out in the flickering lamplight of an abandoned station. The scattered pages of her journal lay around them like fallen snow, each sheet a testament to lives cut short, dreams destroyed. Families left to mourn what they believed were natural deaths, but were actually the carefully orchestrated murders of a woman who had turned killing into an art form. Henry's eyes darted toward the door behind him, measuring the distance, calculating his chances of reaching it before Clara could react. But even as he planned his escape, he knew that running would only delay the inevitable. She had found him once, had orchestrated their meeting with the same careful precision she had used to eliminate 17 other men, and she would find him again if he fled into the night like a coward. The realization that he was probably already marked for death, that his name was likely written in some other journal, hidden away in Clara's belongings, filled him with a strange sense of calm, the peace that comes to a man who has accepted his fate and decided to face it with whatever dignity he can muster. The lamplight caught the metal clasp of the satchel, sending a brief flash of reflected light across Clara's face, and in that moment Henry saw not the gentle woman who had begged for his protection, but the cold-blooded killer who had perfected the art of appearing helpless while wielding death like a surgeon's scalpel. The weight of the satchel in his hand seemed to increase with each passing second, as if the accumulated guilt of her victims was somehow transferring itself to him through the leather and metal that contained the tools of her trade. "You're thinking of running," Clara observed, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she had used to plead for his help. But now Henry heard the underlying amusement, the satisfaction of a predator who had successfully cornered her prey and was enjoying the moment of triumph. Her head tilted slightly to one side, like a bird studying an interesting insect, and Henry realized that she was cataloguing his reactions, filing away his responses for future reference, treating his terror as nothing more than data to be collected and analyzed. The casual cruelty of her observation, the complete absence of any human emotion in her voice, confirmed what Henry had already begun to suspect, that Clara had moved so far beyond the boundaries of normal human experience that she was no longer capable of feeling anything resembling empathy or remorse. The lamplight seemed to dim as she spoke, as if even the flame recoiled from the darkness that emanated from her like heat from a forge. And Henry found himself wondering how many other men had stood where he now stood, listening to that same gentle voice in the moments before their deaths. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the broken walls, and he realized that he was probably hearing not just an observation, but a death sentence, delivered with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. Clara rose from her chair with the fluid grace of a dancer, her movements so smooth and controlled that Henry barely registered the change until she was standing, the lamplight casting her shadow long and dark across the floor between them. The satchel seemed to grow heavier in his hand as she approached, each step measured and deliberate, like a cat stalking a wounded bird. And Henry found himself backing toward the door, even though he knew that escape was probably impossible. Her eyes never left his face, studying his expression with the clinical detachment of a doctor examining a patient, and Henry realized that she was probably memorizing every detail of his terror, filing it away with the memories of 17 other men who had faced their deaths at her hands. The scattered pages of her journal crackled under her feet as she walked, the sound like breaking bones, and Henry caught glimpses of names and dates, fragments of lives that had been snuffed out by the woman who now advanced toward him with the inexorable certainty of death itself. The distance between them seemed to shrink with each step she took, and Henry felt the rough wood of the door frame against his back, solid and real, but offering no real protection against the predator who had made killing her life's work. "I had hoped you might be different," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret that was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. And Henry realized that she was mourning not his impending death, but the loss of whatever fantasy she had constructed around their meeting. The lamplight flickered across her face, revealing features that were still beautiful, still capable of inspiring sympathy and desire. But now Henry saw them for what they truly were, the perfect mask worn by a monster who had learned to mimic humanity while remaining fundamentally alien to it. Her hand moved to the small pocket of her dress, a gesture so casual and natural that Henry almost missed its significance. But the metallic glint of something small and sharp caught the light, and he realized that she was reaching for another tool of her trade, something designed to end lives quickly and quietly. The storm outside had died to a whisper, as if even nature was holding its breath to witness the final act of this deadly drama. And Henry found himself wondering if anyone would ever know what had happened in this abandoned station, if his disappearance would be attributed to bandits or wild animals, or simply the harsh realities of frontier life. The moments stretched between them like eternity, filled with the weight of 17 deaths and the promise of an 18th, while Henry's mind raced through options that all seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion. Clara's hand emerged from her pocket holding a small glass vial, its contents clear and innocent-looking, but Henry knew that it contained the same poison that had claimed the lives of 17 other men. The same death that she had administered with the gentleness of a nurse and the precision of a pharmacist. The lamplight caught the glass, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the walls like the souls of her victims, and Henry realized that he was looking at his own death, distilled into a few ounces of liquid that would stop his heart as surely as a bullet, but leave no trace of violence for anyone to discover. Clara's smile was gentle, almost maternal, as she uncorked the vial, and Henry understood that she genuinely believed she was being merciful, that she saw her method of killing as somehow more humane than the crude violence employed by common murderers. The realization that she had convinced herself that she was performing acts of kindness rather than murder was perhaps the most terrifying revelation of all, confirming that Clara had moved so far beyond the boundaries of sanity that she was no longer capable of recognizing the evil of her actions. The wind outside died completely, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the gentle patter of rain against the broken roof, as if the world itself was waiting to see how this deadly confrontation would end.